But typically here we're talking about a couple with a living trust, a married couple with a joint trust. One of the things I have to establish, and as the surviving spouse, I'm usually going to be the trustee moving forward, the sole trustee of the trust now. Well, I have to know whether my trust creates what's called an A-B split on the death of the first spouse. And how it does that is very important. So I've got to look at the trust document itself and read what it says. You know, does it provide for a division of assets on the death of the first spouse? Or does everything just go to the survivor upon the death of the first spouse? If it does provide for a division of assets on the death of the first spouse, it's usually going to create a survivor's trust, which is the trust of the surviving spouse and into which their share of the estate goes. So typically write half of the estate, my half as the surviving spouse. I have to look to see whether it creates what's called a marital trust. And let's jump at the next slide for a second, and this will also answer our question about, do I need to make new trusts when this happens? Or when children inherit, do they need to make new trusts? So let's talk about how this works. So I have this living trust, right? And it talks about, while my wife and I are alive, how things are managed, how we control the assets in it, that we can amend it, that we can change it, we can put things into it, we can take things out of it. Now my wife passes away. Well, one thing I have to look at is, does the trust divide up into separate trusts when the first spouse dies? And oftentimes it will. And if it does, it will say, my share of the estate as the surviving spouse goes into this survivor's trust. The first to die spouse's share of the estate is going to go into this family trust. Now that family trust can be called lots of different things. It oftentimes is referred to as a credit shelter trust or a bypass trust. Right? We call it a family trust. It often can be called the B trust. I had an accountant tell me one time that, you know, when we talk about this A-B split, you know, the A trust stands for the above ground trust and the B trust is the below ground trust. So it's called lots of different, easy to remember, lots of different things. The next thing I have to look at is, does the trust create a marital trust? This trust oftentimes is called a Q-tip trust, right? And for purposes of the Internal Revenue Code, not because it does anything special. The marital trust can be created, and again, you've got to look at the trust to see what it says, but it can be created if the share of the estate owned by the first to die spouse is in value greater than he or she could pass estate tax free. So let's say I have a couple that has $12 million of assets. They can only pass $5 million estate tax free, or $10 million together. Well, they've got $12 million. So $6 million would go into the survivor's trust. Right? That's the share that I own as the first to die spouse, I wish. But I can only put $5 million into the family trust, because that's the share of the first to die spouse up to the amount that they can pass tax free. Well, I've got an extra $1 million. Right? The first to die spouse owns $6 million, not $5 million. So I could put that extra $1 million into this marital trust. Right? Or I could just put it in the survivor's trust. I could just add it to the survivor's trust. Because for estate tax purposes, when the survivor dies, it's what's in these two trusts that are part of the survivor's estate for tax purposes. Nothing that's in the family trust is included in the survivor's estate for those tax purposes. But I just have to look to the trust to see what it says, because it will tell me where I'm supposed to put that extra $1 million. it'll tell me whether I'm supposed to create this trust or just add it to the survivor's trust. So that's the key as the successor trustee. I just have to follow those instructions.